I'm Al Ferguson, and I'd like to welcome Montana State Representative Zooey Zephyr to Unapologetically Queer. As you may, or perhaps may not know, she's a 38-year-old Democrat, a former University of Montana administrator from left-leaning Missoula. Those are all clue words for you. She made international headlines this year as a transgender lawmaker, a Democratic transgender lawmaker who got expelled from the House floor in Montana for standing up for human and trans rights.
If you disallow the use of the medical care that is accepted by every major medical association, if you disallow that care and don't allow people to have access to that, the only therapy left is either A, meaningless, or B, conversion therapy, which is torture. I also want to point out, again, gender-affirming care is not Orwellian newspeak, as it says in this letter. It is accepted by every major medical association. I will also say what I said down in committee earlier. This bill tries to define male and female as binary. You could not legislate binary sex any more than you could legislate that the earth is flat. Intersex people exist, trans people exist, and this bill doesn't change that. Lastly, I would say that there were conversations at the end of this, at the very end of the bill, the letter that says life-altering medical procedures should wait until they are adults. What I will say is if you are, by this bill and by what these amendments do, if you are forcing a trans child to go through puberty when they are trans, that is tantamount to torture. And this body should be ashamed. And if you vote yes on this amendment and yes on this bill, ooh, I love this. Does everyone want to stand?
Representative Zephyr, would you like to close?
Sorry, I'm yielding to the Majority Leader.
Majority Leader Vinton.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I speak on behalf of our caucus. We will not be shamed by anyone in this chamber. We are better than that.
Representative Zephyr.
And the only thing I will say is if you vote yes on this bill, and yes on these amendments, I hope the next time there's an invocation, when you bow your heads in prayer, you see the blood on your hands.
A manifesto. Representative Zooey Zephyr, we appreciate you joining us today on Unapologetically Queer. I want to start right at the top. I want to learn much more about you, but just broadly, since this is fresh, we just put that exchange in Montana, which led to the prevention of you being able to speak in the Montana State Legislature. Your reaction of these months later of watching that moment, what's going through your mind right now as you rewatch those words and the intensity of that moment?
You know, I have seen firsthand, both when I was in the legislature, the impact that these bills have when they are passed, what it means to remove health care from the trans community. I've seen the impact of the bills when they are debated. One of the things I brought up in a later speech was the fact that we know that a trans teenager attempted to commit suicide while watching one of these hearings. I hear about that. I understand that when you bring these bills forward, you're creating conditions where it's very hard for trans people to live their lives. And reflecting back now, months later, after the Montana legislature has ended for the year, I'm seeing the way in which Republicans federally are trying to put anti-trans riders onto must-pass budget bills in an attempt to not just hurt the trans people in Montana, but hurt all trans youth and trans people across this country. And so I feel proud to have stood up in that moment and a fire to continue to do so.
I want to talk about your journey to get to that moment and moments like it on the Montana State Legislative floor. Where does the courage come from at your young age? Where does the courage come from for you to be able to stand and defend an entire community against a room full of hate that you were saying. You were clear on torture and prayers and blood on your hands. Where does the courage come from to formulate those words and to be the David and Goliath moment?
So I'll make a quick correction. In your opening, you said I was 38. I'm actually 34, so I'm even younger than anticipated. But for me, the courage question is one I get regularly, and I often stumble for an answer because, to me, the right thing doesn't take courage. It's the right thing to do, so you do it. Standing up for a community that is going to lose access to life-saving healthcare shouldn't take courage. It's the right thing to do, so you do it. And I know, as a representative from Missoula, Montana, that my constituents have my back, and that I know I can turn around and go home at the end of the legislative session proud that I represented them the way I know they would want me to. And so that's where the courage comes from, I guess.
You know, we have obviously at Queer News Tonight and Hotspots Magazine, we have a gigantic LGBT audience, but we have a very large trans community audience too. And this is a great opportunity for our LGBTQ plus community as a whole to learn much more about you and to process and digest the courage that we saw on that on the floor of the State House in Montana. Let's talk about you and help us all understand you and how you got to that moment. Tell us about growing up and your experience as a young person and the journey as a trans person and how you got to that moment. Tell us about those days and years to get to the moment that we just watched.
So you talk about youth, and I think, like many trans people my age, I didn't have the words. I knew, but I didn't have the words to describe the feelings I was feeling and who I am. And the word trans didn't enter my lexicon until probably my early 20s, and then it took me a few more years to work up the courage to come out, to be ready for, as LGBTQ people across the identities know, the risk of loss, the risk of losing connections, familial, friends, otherwise, to prep for the courage to face those moments. And once I came out, I quickly realized that I should be doing more to help my community. How do I use my skill sets to get into the rooms where my voice can do good? And that started with activism. It jumped into testifying before the legislature, working with my city council on human rights policy, meeting with the governor's office, on and on. And then I watched a handful of bills pass by one vote, bills allowing a, quote, religious right to discriminate, bills that banned trans people from updating their birth certificates. And I watched them pass by one vote. And I thought to myself, there's got to be trans representation in that room if we're going to ever truly move the needle on these issues.
And you became Montana's first state elected trans official. I have that correct?
I'm the first trans woman, yes. I was elected alongside Representative S.J. Howell, who's the first non-binary representative for the state of Montana. Okay.
And your experience of the embracing who you are, the authenticity of you, starts in your 20s. What about in school age, and you're in your teens? What was life for you like when you were growing up, and sexual identity and other related issues to it? What was that like?
As a teenager, I was an athlete. So I was so focused on, I think, and this is true for a lot of trans people, that when you have your transness and you don't have the words for it, and you don't have the ability to talk about it or be open about it, you often dedicate yourself to other things to try to sort of mask and bury. And I was a 3-sport athlete throughout high school. I was, being honor roll. I was working nonstop. And particularly, I was a high-level wrestler. So I was wrestling after school days from 3 p.m. I'd wrestle until 6, go home, have dinner, and then had a practice mat in my basement, and I would go drill until late at night and then do homework. And so that was my life in high school and at a young age.
So you don't really start to address the questions that you have of your identity until your 20s. When you started to do that in a more rural, remote state like Montana is, did you find the resources around you to help come to the realizations, the transition, etc.? Was that a positive experience, or was it a difficult experience? Because you're not in a major metropolitan city. The LGBT story is New York, Boston, Washington, Miami, Fort Lauderdale, Austin, Los Angeles, San Diego, San Francisco, Seattle. And, instantaneously I say, those are the 10 places Chicago, that LGBT is. Montana doesn't appear on any of those lists. So this experience, do you imagine it was harder for you because you're in Montana? Or what was the experience like?
Yeah, it's a shame. Missoula, Montana should appear on that list. But I think, right at the beginning, it's important to note that much like media focuses on those areas, I think LGBTQ topics, when people are reporting on things or talking about cities, they'll focus on those major cities. But LGBTQ people are everywhere. And we are part of what it means to be not just in a community, but a part of all communities. Wherever there is community, you will find us. And I was fortunate in Missoula to have a strong community of friends, coworkers around me. And when I first was beginning to speak openly around topics of my trans identity and was saying, I'm trans or binary or something is going on here, the first person I told it to was a partner who went, yeah, that tracks. Like, that makes sense to me. And also, like, however I can support you. Those conversations, are positive, but scary, because there is always the fear, and that the fear is true whether or not you're in Seattle or you are in small town Montana. Mm-hmm. There is the fear that you're going to lose something when coming out. And I think finding that community at the forefront at the beginning helped me surrounding myself with people who are loving and supportive. That helped me through the coming out process. I'm curious also your experience in Montana, to the courage of what we saw at the top of our interview on the floor of the State House in Montana. I have the luxury sitting here in South Florida, so your story might not completely resonate in the same way if it was here in South Florida, or it was in New York, or it was in Massachusetts, but you're in Montana. So many LGBTQ plus and for trans that are in more rural places: Iowa, Wyoming, Montana, Nebraska, etc., South Dakota, that watch you. What would you say to LGBT in more rural states like Montana that watch you in terms of how you've stood up and how you've had the courage to be authentic and be you, and be in this David and Goliath kind of fight that you're in the state house in Montana? What would you say to LGBT and trans in rural states that are not in these 10 major metropolitan cities where so many LGBT and trans live? What would you say to them? I think it's important to recognize that many of us who live in rural states, even rural red states, aren't just places where we reside. Those are deep down our homes, where our hearts are. And I've talked to people who have fled states, fled to more blue states from rural red states. And that's important to note, that first and foremost, they are taking care of themselves. And they are trying to find a place where they can get the care they need, where they can live a life that isn't under constant threat from their government. But for many of them, they're leaving family behind, family and friends who are alive. And for many, they're leaving places where grandparents, great-grandparents are buried. And that's hard. And it's important that we have people who are capable of doing so, who feel the comfort and security in doing so, to stand up and fight for our homes. And I think more than anything, and this is a message both for the people in rural red states, but also if you're sitting in New York and Seattle and saying, why don't you run? Why don't you go elsewhere? You could live a much happier life in somewhere else. Forget that these places are deep, meaningful places to us. And there will always be people who are willing to stay and fight to try to make our states places where trans people, LGBTQ people, and all people more broadly feel confident and comfortable trying to put down roots and live a happy life.
That is beautifully, beautifully said. Let's talk about what you faced in Montana. As I indicated right before we went on the air, we have covered you quite a bit at Queer News tonight. Multiple speeches that you've delivered, multiple issues of what the State House has done. We have covered it. It has made international news, but let's refine it to a fine point. Republican Governor of Montana, Greg Gianforte, signed a bill defining the word sex. Now, you wonder why a governor would need to do that, but that's what he did. He defined the word sex in state law as only male or female, joining only Kansas and Tennessee so far, which have similar laws that LGBTQ plus advocates argue will deny legal recognition to non-binary and transgender people. Zoe, help us understand, and because we're going to use our conversation in Montana as extrapolating to other places, help us understand what's going on in Montana. Why is this happening?
So we are seeing let's talk about the sort of totality of these attacks. We are seeing bills, anti-trans bills particularly, targeting trans people's pasts, presents, and futures. When you take a book ban, for instance, when you take LGBTQ memoirs off of the shelves, you're removing personal histories around LGBTQ people. When you disallow schools from teaching about LGBTQ history, when you ban drag, you are banning an art form that is connected to queer history in this country. When you look back at the way 3 articles of clothing laws were used to target gay and trans community members 50 years ago. When you look at things that ban our present, that's the kind of Senate Bill 458. That's the kind of attacks that Senate Bill 458 are doing. When you disallow gender markers to be updated on your birth certificates, when you disallow driver's licenses to be accurate, you are creating a barrier where it is very difficult for trans people to go through their daily life. I remember prior to getting my documents updated, getting kicked out of bars, not for having done anything, but for going into and showing the bouncer my ID and him saying, "That ain't you, Missy." And I needed to get an updated ID that reflected who I am. You see those kinds of things. And then you look at bills that ban our futures. And you look at banning healthcare, obviously banning trans care for trans people takes away our ability to have a joyous life, to have that pursuit of happiness. But you also look at what Senate Bill 458 does when it defines sex as binary. You know, I am engaged. My fiance has a 7-year-old. I hope to live a long and happy life with both of them. Whenever I die, I hope my tombstone says, "Here lies Zooey Zephyr, loving mother, loving wife, leaves behind X, Y, and Z." The state of Montana says that's all fine and good. Loving mother, loving wife, neat. But on the back end, we're going to make sure it's noted that you're a man. And that kind of stuff is some of the painful harm that a bill like this can do, because it tells you that no matter what you do in your life, the government will never see you for who you are. Those are what these kinds of bills can rob trans people of.
In 2023, You are among the most articulate that I have watched in America, and that is a significant observation on the trans story about healthcare. Of course, it's major forefront story here in Florida. You have likened gender-affirming care bans in Montana to eradication. You use words like blood on your hands. Of course, you use the possibility of suicide, but especially the words related to eradication of a segment of population. Tell me about why you talk about healthcare bans for trans community in those terms.
Well, one, we know that Michael Knowles at CPAC said that that was the goal. He said in his own words that the goal was the eradication of trans people from public life entirely. And when you see not just healthcare bans, but the breadth of the attacks on the trans community, it's important that we not shy away from them. Because legislators, they want you when they bring a bill forward. They want you to say, look at this piece of bill, this piece of legislation. It's really narrowly focused on one. It's really about one book. It's really about trans people in sports. It's really about this narrow path. But it's not. For example, when trans sports bans come forward, people who are bringing those bans aren't longtime advocates of women's athletics. What they're actually trying to get you to do is to accept an asterisk about trans people. They want you to think trans women are women, asterisk, except for when it comes to sports. Trans people down the line, they'll say trans people deserve health care, asterisk, unless they're under 18. Oh, wait, actually, just kidding. That asterisk is unless they're under 25. Oh, wait, that asterisk is actually until there's more research done. So they're always trying to get you to accept more and more capitulations and more restrictions on trans care because their goal, in their words, is the eradication of trans people from public life entirely. And we even saw a report come out about GenSpec yesterday, one of the leading anti-trans organizations, that revealed that their goal is full adult healthcare bans. And when you take that goal with the fact that we see how much of an impact access to gender-affirming care does, what kind of impact that has on the reduction of suicidality, of the quality of life for trans people, if you are removing that care, that increases the risk of suicide. That eradicates a community from public life. That's why it's so important to use these words and call these attacks out for what they are.
Yeah, that leads to you being expelled from the House floor of Montana for standing up for that. First off, I'm curious, how did voters broadly in Montana react to that moment of your expulsion, and your of your district in Missoula? How did they respond? Was it the same or different, or how did voters in general in Montana react to the news of what was done to you?
You know, I once got asked in an interview, how do you deal with negative comments in person? Like, you can ignore the trolls online, but how do you deal with negative comments in your day-to-day life? And I said, I'd let you know if I'd had one in response to what has happened in Montana here. But voters very, very much, the citizens of Montana understand what I stood up for. I stood up on a bill about gender-affirming care. But when the speaker went forward to deny me the ability to speak on the House floor, it became clear that I was standing up in defense of democracy. And I have heard that from my district, where a rally was held 48 hours after my removal from the House floor, that held thousands of people, to broadly across the state of Montana. I was in a hotel in Montana and was checking in at midnight, and a security guard sidled over to me, leaned over and said, "The National Guard has your back." And I was in Glacier National Park on another trip with my fiance, and I pulled off to the side of the road to look at this vista, and up comes a big Ford F-150 behind me, and out hops this mid-50s guy, big flannel jeans, and he points at me and he goes, "Zooey Zephyr." And I'm in a national park about as far away from political conversations as you could be. And he says, "I gotta let you know right off the bat, I'm a Republican." And he starts listing off moderate Republicans in our state. And he goes, I'm a Republican, but I'd have sat on that bench for you. You are my hero. And I think this is true across the political spectrum. People understand that we're not having policy conversations. We're having conversations in this moment around the first principles of our country and how important it is to stand up in defense of those first principles. And by and large, people understand that.
Help me understand how Montana and then the rest of the country, the radical, more red locations in America, help me understand how they can make the decision that they're going to mute you by removing your First Amendment right as an elected official, but all Americans, but as an elected official for free speech, your First Amendment right to express an opinion. It seems like that they're at the top of the pyramid of the violation of the constitutional guarantees that we all have. Or am I missing something?
You have hit it perfectly. I think we, as legislators, we do not lose our right to free speech once we are elected. And particularly when representing our community, it's important that our constituents have representation. If a supermajority in any state can band together and silence a representative, they could vote to silence any representative. And if a supermajority can silence anyone in the superminority and remove representation, that is a harrowing moment for our democracy. And it's something that people should be concerned about and be willing to fight back against.
Yes, and we're talking about it all of the time. And one of the examples of illustration of why we're talking about it is Zooey Zephyr. Another question that I understand your reaction. I love to hear the reaction that you've gotten among electorate in Montana. I understand the observation that of the danger warning that you have of the legislature in Montana. But I'm curious about you personally. You are expelled from being able to speak on the House floor as a duly elected state representative. That must have been a humiliating moment. Was it humiliating for you?
No. I knew in the moment that I had stood up in defense of my community. I knew that I had stood up in defense of democracy. And I knew that when they brought the motion forward, they would not have brought a motion they did not have the votes for. They know how to count their votes. And so what I felt in that moment was as far from humiliation as I could possibly feel. I felt proud for having stood up on the right side of history, stood up for what was moral and just to do. And I felt determined going forward to do the work as best I could for my community and for the people of Montana.
That answer actually really surprises me, and I'm an old, jaded, queer news guy, and I'm rarely surprised, and that answer is breathtaking to me. I want to move outside of Montana and talk about the LGBTQ community across America and what we can learn from your story. We're watching, trans is the #1 story in America. And maybe perhaps everyone in LGBT does not know it, but in terms of the focus of all of the hundreds and hundreds of anti-LGBT bills that we're seeing, about 50 to 60% of them are aimed at the trans community. And we're watching it all over red states, basically, in America. And by the way, Florida, shockingly, is in that same category. I'm curious about the support the trans community is getting in the LGBTQ plus community. What are your thoughts about how you have watched this year the broad queer community and its support for trans? Are you thinking we're doing a good job? Are we not doing enough? What do you think? In terms of how our community is standing up and coming to the aid and defense of our trans brothers and sisters?
I think locally in Missoula, I'm very proud to say that I have a community that has an eye to intersectionality and understands that the fight for trans rights is interwoven with the fight for all queer rights, is interwoven with the fight for abortion access, for disability rights. People here understand that. And I think broadly, people across the country do. I think when I traveled traveled the country for Pride Month to various Pride festivals, I saw a lot of that understanding. I saw a lot of people who got it, or who, if they didn't understand what it meant to be trans or understand the nuance of the trans experience, were willing to understand and empathize with me as a person and say, I trust that you are doing what's right for your community. I trust that your community, I believe that your fight is important. And this is something I think people from the outside or news orgs might try to make it appear like the LGBTQ community is trying to pick each other off, but we know that's not the case. We know that deep down we have one another's backs, and we have for decades. And yeah, so I see that there's always more to be done, particularly from organizations across the country who are, more broader institutionalized players in federal politics. There's more that they can be doing, and there's always work ahead because, as I've mentioned, we've seen the attacks start at the state levels. There are anti-trans riders and in every piece of must-pass budget policy going forward right now.
I hear some optimism in your voice, which is cheery to me, because I have so many trans friends. Last night I did Queer News Tonight, and two of our anchors at Queer News Tonight, sitting on both sides of me, on each side of me, were trans representation. And in the trans community, I hear frequently fear and uncertainty about what's going on. And you give a rare breath of fresh air of optimism. What would you say to the trans community around the country, here in Florida, that are just really scared about where all of this is going?
I hope that the optimism that I have, the hope that I have, it's important to note that it is not coming from a place of naivety. I have that hope despite knowing that these are, state by state, federally and across the globe, efforts to eradicate the trans community from public life. I understand that. I see these attacks for what they are. I live it daily in the legislature. But that hope that I have comes from having seen LGBTQ communities across the country who are dedicated to the work and are not going to stop until our community is safe, until our community can live lives of joy and peace. And for me, what I would say to LGBTQ people across the country is look at those of us who are doing the work. Know that you don't have to do this work. You can do whatever work feels right for you in whatever rooms you feel like your voice can do good in. And sometimes that room is your own apartment. It is looking in the mirror and standing tall with confidence, going to the coffee shop with confidence. Sometimes that's enough. Having a conversation can be enough. But trust that if you are doing the work in the spaces that you're in, and people like myself and the rest of the trans people who are more broadly visible in politics are doing the work in the rooms we're in, together, that is how we move the needle. And it is why I have so much hope, and that it's the reason that hope isn't just a cushion I'm sitting on. It is a fire that fuels me.
That's lovely. Powerful words. I smiled as you started in that explanation of the call, the clarion call of optimism for the trans community, because I read, and I believe I even reported on it, the day after you were ousted in Montana for the state as state representative and being able to speak, you posted a solicitation on social media that I remember seeing. And the day after you had the ouster, you posted a request for seeking donations for your reelection to the House. Right from the get-go, you said, "Oh, I'm not going anywhere." What was the thinking behind that of saying, you know, if you're going to get into this fight, I need some money to help me stay in this fight? Tell me about that.
It was, I believe it was almost a week after the ousting, because I remember many people saying, put a call out right now, put a call out right now. And me saying, no, give me, I want to wait till I know that the session's going to be over before I announce running for reelection. But for me, you know, it's important that people understand that these policies are cruel. These policies cause harm. Actions that they took against me in the legislature caused harm. And it can do a lot of damage. But the one thing you cannot do is make me afraid and make me step back from the fight. And that was one of the ways of showing that I am going to be in this fight for a long time if the people of Montana will continue to elect me.
Yeah, that's great. And Zooey, I would be remiss if I didn't ask you, other political plans beyond being a state representative? You're just 34. Have you thought, maybe any of that going on?
For me, when I ran for office initially, I was in an MFA program. I was doing a master's in creative writing and a master's in literature. I was working in university administration. I didn't have grand plans in the political realm. And I remember meeting with my senator when I felt that fire to run for office and saying, what is the room that my voice can do good in? How do I best use my voice to make the kind of change I want to see in the state? And he said, the state legislature, that's the front lines. That's where you need to be right now. And obviously, when your national profile sort of elevates, people start saying, hey, here's another room you could be in. Here's a place that your voice could do good in. And obviously, you take all that information in and you ask yourself, what is the best place for me? Is it at the state level where the bulk of the attacks are coming, where you can impact the people in your state, you can impact their daily life most dramatically with state legislation? Is that at the federal level, where you are seeing the beginnings of the anti-LGBTQ policy, and you are seeing swaths of anti-union policies as well, which is another big fight of mine? Those are legitimate questions, and they are ones that I wrestled with for a long time, and ones that I continue to ask. And the good news is there's not a wrong answer. Yeah. You go to the place you feel your heart is telling you can do the most good in.
Yeah. Plans. I know I'm talking to you in Washington today. Are you going to tell me, you're getting ready to announce some grand plans to? No, not yet.
There's no great secret in the works right now. Okay. There is a lot of questions on my heart and a lot of work to be done for the state of Montana, and I will dedicate myself to that work.
Okay, heard loud and clear. I also wanted to congratulate you. In the midst of all of this news about you in 2023, you got engaged. You've mentioned it already. We followed it and reported on it, your proposal to Erin Reed in front of hundreds of people. It was so nice to see so much happiness. Not only is it in trans story, but in this year of so much LGBT attack by radical right and radical evangelical, and you're getting married. Tell me about that experience and Erin Reed and the love story that is going on now in your life.
If you wanted me to tell you all about Erin Reed, I'd need another 90 minutes, maybe more. But what I will say is she has been so just a light to me. And the work that I do, the way that I feel, I go into every day just fully with my tank full. And I owe so much of that to her. And in that moment, the engagement, she had seen what was happening at the legislature and wasn't planning to come out. And then once everything was unfolding, she said, I need to be there for you. I'm going to show up right as the legislative session is over so that we can just be together. And then we'd been talking about getting engaged in July. I went to France recently. That's where we were going to get engaged. But she told me she was coming up to Montana, and then my ring actually arrived early. And I put two and two together, and I said, well, why don't we do this at Queer Prom? And so I asked the question a little bit early and surprised her, as you can see by her face there. And it felt like in that moment, again, I said, you cannot make me afraid. You cannot make me back down. The other thing you can't take away is queer love. Like, I love who I am as a person. I love my community, and I love Erin so deeply. And I feel so blessed to have her in my life.
Yeah, it's a beautiful story, as I say, and actually exacerbated as a beautiful story in the time that we're living currently. And it's unfortunately a rare-ish opportunity for joy, which is what that moment represented. One question I do want to ask you about, Erin, is you have made the choice. You made a choice. This representation, to deliver speeches like you have done on the floor of the House in Montana, your stand up for community. Erin didn't make that choice. And I hear what you just said in terms of coming later and saying, okay, I'm joining you. But how do you feel about how difficult it's going to be for her to be with Zooey Zephyr? Have you thought about that?
I think you might be underestimating my fiance. Erin is one of the leading LGBTQ independent journalists. She reports on every piece of anti-trans legislation across the country. She was getting, doxxed from far-right people long before I was in office. This is not new territory for her. We are working in different lanes, with hers being reporting and mine being policy, but both of us are no strangers to attacks from the far right, to the impacts it has on our personal lives and the impacts that the risks that come with it. We're no strangers to it, but we are dedicated to the work together. Yeah.
So we've got a Batman and Robin duo starting to form for LGBT and the trans community. I love that. I also want to take a moment. You came to Florida, as you mentioned, during Pride Month. You came to West Palm Beach, just north of our studios, where we're doing this interview right now, and it was about the experience of Florida, and Florida is kind of ground zero for America in terms of apparently what we want to export and the hate we want to export to every other state in America. Two of the leading Republican candidates are both Floridians, both from South Florida, living here in South Florida. There's been lots of calls for boycotts of traveling to Florida, and lots of discussion about the safety of trans people coming to Florida. And we've dealt with a variety of different issues on both of those fronts. What are your thoughts about that, about Florida in general, and calling for a boycott and concern for trans people coming to Florida? Any thoughts on either of those subjects?
The risk for trans people in Florida is real. The bathroom bans that are existing in Florida now, that I believe are active now, come with threats of jail time. They are a real danger, not to trans people, in the privacy of their own homes, but trans people anytime they go out into the public world are at risk in the state of Florida. I think there are a handful of groups who have listed travel advisories saying, hey, heads up, if you're trans, I would avoid Florida broadly. I think that's wise. There is a risk, a very high risk in the state. That said, there are trans people who are living in Florida, who are fighting for their homes in Florida. There are trans people who don't live in Florida that maybe have family who do, who need to go back. And we hold both of those truths in our hearts at the same time. As for boycotts, I would need more specifics on that. I'm always, curious about the impetus for particular boycotts. But yeah.
I have one other topical thing that I wanted to get observation on. We've watched in Pride Month the implementation. We always talk about rainbow capitalism. We reported on it repeatedly at Queer News Tonight. Everyone seems to come out of the woodwork and embrace LGBTQ community. Bud Light and the dust up with Mulvaney and Bud Light and Bud Light provides a can with Mulvaney's face on it, and Mulvaney does an embracement and taste, clearly tasting Bud Light for the first time in her life. What was your reaction to the campaign, to Bud Light, to Mulvaney, to the crazy video of the rock star who shall not be named, old rock star, who takes an Uzi machine gun and shoots Bud Light? What the whole thing about the Bud Light embracement? Did you have any thoughts? Anything you want to say about it?
So that's a great question. I love the way you listed all of the different things that you could focus on. And to me, the first thing in there is to say, what is worth calling attention to in this moment? And for me, one of the really clear things is when I talk about eradication, when I talk about that type of language, it's important to look at, legislators come forward. I said this earlier in the interview, and they say, this bill is just about a book. This bill is just about this particular subset of healthcare. It's important to recognize, and it becomes clear in these moments, that the people who want these bills, the rabid supporters who are pushing their elected officials or who are amped up by anti-LGBTQ and anti-trans policies, they're not having a conversation around sports or healthcare. They don't want to see a trans woman get an ad deal. They don't want to see a trans woman appear on the cover of Sports Illustrated. They don't want to see Target have rainbows. Their rage is all-encompassing in these moments. And that is part of the threat. And that's what I turn to. And I say, if you are wondering, what's going on with LGBTQ policy and why are these people fighting so hard about this specific policy or that specific policy, it's because we see broadly the breadth of what these attacks are really about and the way in which people who support them are, again, looking at an all-encompassing rage towards LGBTQ people and trans people.
Yeah, I'm going to think much about that phrase, all-encompassing rage. And speaking of all-encompassing rage, Governor Ron DeSantis, thoughts about what we're watching from the presidential candidate toward the trans community, toward the LGBTQ community, what he's trying to export to the rest of the nation? Thoughts on the governor?
We have seen, from his campaign, we've seen videos come out that really, again, he's shown he wants this to be a cornerstone. He wants anti-LGBTQ policy, anti-trans policy to be a cornerstone of his campaign, anti-quote woke policy, which seems to be a catch-all for marginalized communities or communities he doesn't like. We've seen him try to make this a cornerstone of his campaign. But what I would say is, and it's what I said when I came to Florida, we are no stranger to people like that in history. People throughout history have tried to make hate a cornerstone of their political careers. And broadly, what they will find is that they wind up as footnotes in history. Because LGBTQ people have been fighting this fight for generations. We are rooted in every single community, and people are beginning more and more to understand. People know more trans people now. People know gay, lesbian, bisexual people more now. The acceptance is going up. People who try to push this hate, they may find marginal successes. They may find successes like a governorship, but in the long course of history, they will find themselves as footnotes, and they will find themselves on the wrong side.
Yeah, it's interesting to me that you say that, because I am a student of history, and I have spoken many times that Senator Joe McCarthy in the 1950s, in his lavender scare about the LGBTQ community and the red scare of everyone was a communist, and the lies that he told, he became that antiquated footnote in history and disgrace. And Governor George Wallace in Alabama, in his anti-black and anti-education and anti-integration, has become the same thing, an asterisk of the lies and the hate that he tried to sell as an asterisk in history. You make a very good point that Governor Ron DeSantis will be the same, just bad asterisks in history. Very interesting point. Zooey Zephyr, I have to tell you, in the LGBTQ community, watching very rural state Montana, you have been interesting for all of us to watch, because it literally is a David and Goliath story. Literally. Even in Montana, it is a David and Goliath story. We all suspected that you were very, very interesting in what you represented for the LGBTQ community. I have to tell you, in first opportunity to meet and talk to you, my goodness, you so outproduce what we're watching that you have done. It is really breathtakingly amazing. And in all gratitude for the trans community and for the LGBTQ community, we thank you for being in the fight. That is clear in this interview today. We encourage you, get more details on Zooey Zephyr. You can see her everywhere in social media. You can follow her at IG at Zoe and Behold, on Instagram and Twitter, and at Facebook at Zooey Zephyr. Representative Montana, Representative Zooey Zephyr, thank you so much for joining us today on Unapologetically Queer.
It's an honor, and I'm blessed to be in the fight with all of you.
Thank you.